International Cultic Studies Association, helping people since 1979. About ICSA. Founded in 1979, the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, is a global network of people concerned about psychological manipulation and abuse in cultic and other high-control environments. ICSA is tax-exempt, supports civil liberties, and is not affiliated with any religious or commercial organizations. Our mission. ICSA provides information, education, and help to those affected by or interested in cultic and other high-control groups and relationships. Join or donate today at icsahome.com/membership. Disclaimer. Views expressed on ICSA websites or in ICSA's publications or events are those of the document's author or speaker and are not necessarily shared, endorsed, or recommended by ICSA or any of its directors, staff, or advisors. Wendy Duncan has a master's degree from the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and is a licensed social worker in the state of Texas. She has spent most of her career in the mental health field. Wendy and her husband Doug are former members of a pseudo-Christian Bible-based cult, and several years after leaving, they became active in cult awareness activities. They are frequent presenters at ICSA conferences. Wendy co-facilitates a monthly support group for former members of cults in the Dallas Metroplex. Wendy is also the author of I Can't Hear God Anymore, Life in a Dallas Cult.
We welcome everybody today to our webinar about scary stuff, but positive stuff. Wendy's chapter in our book on wounded faith, I think, is one of the best chapters in our book. And Wendy, welcome. We're glad you're here with us for this webinar today. I almost said podcast because I do a podcast too, and sometimes I'm not sure what the difference is between one or another, but this is a little different. And we're delighted. This is the fourth in the series. We're interviewing various people who contributed to the book. The book came out of a conference that we did in 2018, I think, in Hartford, Connecticut. And at that time, we thought, why don't we write a book about what we've just talked about for this conference? So that's where the book came from. And today, the subject is Healing Your Image of God, which is an interesting concept because I don't think God needs his image healed, except for the fact that people's image of God has been seriously impacted by all kinds of spiritual abuse situations. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Wendy, welcome. We're glad you're willing to do this today and talk with us about the chapter that you wrote and the subject that you've been thinking about. You say in the chapter, I've got the chapter on my computer screen here, so I'll be referring to some of the things that you say in the chapter. But to start with, you've sort of focused on the question, how do I believe again after I've become disillusioned because of some spiritual abuse that has happened? And I felt like that's a positive strategy is to sort of assume or hope that people want to recover their faith, their spiritual life. So just start us off and say a little bit about how did you come up with this question, Wendy?
Well, when I was at that conference in Hartford, after I finished my talk, a young woman came up to me and she said, how do I believe again? And it was so powerful. That moment was so powerful for me because I'm looking at this young woman who has a lot of sadness, confusion, distress. I mean, all those things. And she's like, how do I do it? How do I believe again? After you've been in a spiritually abusive or a cultic group, how do you go about believing again? Because most of the people that we have dealt with, they're so angry with God when they leave their cult or their spiritually abusive group. They say, why would a loving God have allowed me to get involved in this? So they have all these questions and they blame God and they're angry with him. So, the question of how do you believe again? How do you get through that process and recapture your relationship with God? I see Steve Martin here. Hi, Steve. And his brother, Paul, used to run a residential facility for people that had been involved in cults or spiritually abusive groups. And he said, one of the primary tasks of recovery is redefining who God is changing your image of God. And he said, a lot of people don't want to deal with it. And we always tell them that's okay. But at some point during your recovery process, you got to figure out who God is, what your relationship is, and work through all that pain and that grief and that confusion. At some point, you have to do that. And by the way, I have a little bit of laryngitis, so I don't usually talk this way. I hope y'all can understand me. Anyway, it is a task of recovery, and it's usually not one of the first tasks, but it is certainly a task at some point, because most people who get involved in religious cults or religious dysfunctional groups, they went in because they had a heart for God. They wanted to know more about God. They wanted a closer relationship with him. They had a heart. And then they get involved in a group that is abusive, and they don't know what to believe. They don't, the God who they thought was loving and kind.
So Wendy, let's back up for a second. What if a person who entered the faith process, exploring God, getting to know God, however one would want to put it, they are hurt, they are injured, they're abused, they come out of that and they decide there is no God. So I'm going to read John Paul Sartre now. I'm going to read Friedrich Nietzsche now. And so, that's why I wanted to start this interview today with just highlighting the fact that you, in your chapter, are sort of assuming that people want it. Something deep inside of them has not died. They want to recover their sense of God. But what about someone who says, I give up? Just say something to that very quickly. Because
we have been facilitating a support group for people, for former members, for about 15 years now. And that is actually the most common response is, I don't believe God exists. I don't believe in God anymore. I don't want anything to do with him. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to look at the Bible. I don't want to do any of that. He's not going to be a part of my life anymore. In fact, I don't even believe that there is a God.
So you've seen
that's so common. It's so common. But Doug and I feel like that's just a part of the recovery process. Of course, you're going to be angry, but it's just part of that process. And so we say to folks like that, we say, understand, we got it. You've been hurt. Yes, totally. And we don't ever say anything. Most of the time, we don't ever say anything about, you got to fix that relationship with God at some point. We don't go there. Our the support group that we lead is not a Bible-based or Christian-centered focused group.
So you don't get preachy.
We don't get preachy about that. We probably get preachy about other stuff, but.
So you quote, Wendy, you quote Judith Herman, in your chapter in the book. And I'm going to read this quote: traumatic events undermine the belief systems that give meaning to human experience. They violate the victim's faith in a natural and divine order, cast the victim into a state of existential crisis. I thought that was a great quote to sort of just encapsulate what people have felt when they've been abused. And then you say, your words here are, as stressful as an existential crisis is, it can be the beginning of a journey toward healing our spiritual abuse and reclaiming our spiritual identity. So let's talk about the problem. The problem is how God is viewed, correct?
Right.
When he is presented or modeled or taught to be something other than how he really is.
Right.
How is he presented that's wrong, that's so hurtful?
All cults, all religious abusive groups distort the character of God. All of them do. Different ways they distort his character, but they do not portray him the way he is. For example, my husband and I were in a Bible-based pseudo-Christian cult. And when we got in, so I was a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I was a licensed social worker, and I had grown up in the Baptist church, and I wasn't a kid either. But somehow I got involved in this group. And when I first started going to their Bible studies, I thought to myself, I don't believe what they believe. And then at some point I said, I don't really know what I believe. And then at some point, I did believe what they were believing. And they taught that God hates you. God hates you.
Did they actually say that, Wendy?
Yes.
Yeah.
God hates you. He only loves you if you're part of the body of Christ, the bride of Christ. And of course, the body was our group. The bride of Christ was our group. So he only loves you if you're still a part of that group. But he was harsh and mean and incompassionate. Always wanted to squash you like a bug if you did anything wrong. And so I had that very harsh image of God when I came out of my group. Now, years and years and years before, I had encountered God, and it was such a powerful experience. And, it changed my life. And so when I came out of the group, I remembered dimly, that was the God that I fell in love with. But I didn't know who he was now. And so I didn't know what to do. I'd go to churches, and I would gravitate toward evangelical churches because that was what I was used to. And I would go, and they would, maybe it was a song or the way something the preacher said, it would kind of freak me out and trigger me. And I'd hike out the back door before the service was over. I couldn't read my Bible. I couldn't pray. There were times I talked to God and I said, God, I want to have a relationship with you, I think, but I don't like you. I don't like you. And so, but I thought, I'm going to stumble through this and see what I can do. So that was kind of the beginning of my recovery is trying to figure out who God is. And so I read a lot of books, a lot of writers that talked about their struggle with their own relationship with God or their spirituality. They struggled with it, and they struggled and struggled and struggled until they reconnected with God. And so I thought, well, maybe I can do that too. So I don't know. I think every person's journey back to God, whether they can acknowledge it or not, it's one of the most important things that they'll ever do.
So you have identified some very fundamental questions that need to be addressed, and I'm going to read them from the book. Just take a second here. You say, sadly, many survivors are unable to get beyond the initial questions. Here's what the questions are. Why would a loving God have allowed me to get involved with this group? So a why question. Second of all, where was God when I was going through the emotional pain? These are deep questions. These are excellent questions. Thirdly, why did God not protect me? And you're suggesting that people need to face up to these questions, whether they have the same words or not.
Mm-hmm.
Why would a loving God allow me to get involved? Where was he when I was feeling the pain, and why didn't he protect me? Anything you can add to that, or that you want to embellish on those questions? Because I think those questions are the center, and it's not just in cultic groups. I think these are relevant for people in Orthodox churches where there is some element of abusive leadership going on. Mm. They need to ask these questions too. So is there any more that you can add to these questions?
You know, our image of God is so important because it affects our behavior. If I believe that God is a bully, and I'm married to a bully, when he abuses me, I just take it. So our image of God affects our behavior. It also affects our sense of who we are. If I see God as harsh, then I'm going to be harsh with myself. I'm going to be very performance-based with myself if that's who I see God. So, you know, there's so many reasons why our concept of God is crucial. I read a lot of books, like I said, and some of the books that I've read, evangelical Christians would probably shake their head and say, Wendy, why did you read that one? But like, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with The Shack, but The Shack
you bring
tells
this up in the chapter.
Yeah. The Shack tells the story of a man whose daughter was brutally killed. And he ends up, having an encounter with God in three persons. And one of them was a Black woman who was kind of like a mama figure. And then one was Jesus. And then the other one was God. Anyway, it showed different aspects of God that most people don't see him like that. And to me, it was just real powerful to look at God through different lenses. We think about God as being somebody way up there, just kind of looking down on us and, kind of checking on things every once in a while, but he really doesn't have anything to do with us individually, which is what my cult leader taught, that God doesn't want to have a relationship with you. Why would the God of the universe want to have a relationship with you, Wendy? Or why do you think God wants you to pray, Wendy? Why would he want to hear from you? So he challenged all those things about a personal relationship with the God. And so, all of that had to be dealt with when I was in recovery. So it helped to read other people's experiences. It helped to read about other people's struggles. And
now you have said you had a fairly stable and a fairly good foundation when you became involved in the group, right?
Yes.
How could that? I think that's really an important aspect of getting drawn into a group. How could that? What was it about the group that deconstructed what was basically pretty solid thinking on your part about who God is before you got into the group? Even how was it? Just by they were smarter than you were, they were more intimidating, what was it? What was it that made it come unraveled in your God concept in your own mind?
That's a good question. Before I ever went to Trinity Foundation, I had some church hurts.
Some disappointments, you mean?
Disappointments, hurts.
Yeah. Okay.
And before I encountered God as an adult, it was in my last semester of school. But prior to that, I had been married and I was divorced. And so after I had that encounter with God, within the year, I felt like he was calling me to some kind of service. And so this is a long story. And I think I tell about it in my other book, I Can't Hear God Anymore. But felt like God was calling me to ministry. So I went and talked to my pastor, and I said, I think God's calling me to ministry. And he said, and I will never forget this, he said, "Oh, hon, you can't be in ministry. You're divorced. You don't know how men will look at you." And of course, that freaked me out. But so I put it aside for a while, but I kept going back to him. And I kept saying, I really think that God's calling me to do this. So I want to go to seminary. Okay, so fast forward, eventually I got to seminary. That was a long process too, because they don't like divorced people in Baptist seminaries. At least they did then. And so when I got to seminary, I didn't tell anybody that I was divorced. It was my deep, dark secret. I wasn't going to share it with anybody, except then I shared it with my roommate and then somebody else. But most people did not even know I was divorced. And then I tried to apply to be a missionary, and the mission board said, "No, we don't want you." That was my interpretation. But I mean, they said it nice, but they said no. So I went in a different direction, and I worked as a social worker in the mental health field. And then, I mean, there were a lot of things happened.
Yeah, sure.
So at the time that I met Doug, actually met Doug in Austin. We had both gone to a workshop that was telling us how to apply for money for homeless people. And so Doug was working in Dallas with homeless people. I was working in Fort Worth with homeless people. So we both ended up there. And at some point we started talking, and I really didn't have a church then. And I had a relationship with God, but I didn't have a church. I didn't feel comfortable in churches either. And he said, "Well, you ought to come to our church. We have Bible study just about every night of the week. And on Sundays, we have a great big old family meal, and everybody brings a dish. And, we sit around a table, and, it's just like one big old happy family." It was kind of intriguing, But
It was an attraction.
It was attractive, but I had enough seminary training to decide I need to check on this group and see if they're legitimate. So I called various cult awareness groups and asked them, and all of them said, Trinity Foundation, we don't see Trinity Foundation rising to the label of cult, but they are eccentric. So I'm like, okay. So I go to the first time I went, the people were so nice. They were so friendly. The music was absolutely beautiful. And I just fell in.
Yeah.
It was just, and nobody cared that I was divorced. They all thought I was too good. They thought I was too Christian-y. Me, I had an image of myself as being a horrible, horrible, miserable Christian. But these people thought I was okay. So I get hooked in. I start going. And like I said, and this is true of a thought reform environment, is, maybe you don't believe what they're teaching at first. But the more that you get sucked into it, it changes your thinking. There is a thought reform going on. And it certainly was going on in my case.
Yeah. So
I answered the question.
No, that's great. That's great. And that one probably caught you off guard a little bit, but I think it's important because yeah. So the last question I want to ask you before we open it up for other questions from people is the interesting aspect of how you and Doug, I'm just going to read from your book. My husband suggested we go to a liturgical church, such as Catholic or Episcopal. I found that this form of worship gave me a new way to worship that was meaningful and spiritually fulfilling. There was a sense of security and comfort in knowing that the liturgy was connected to an ancient tradition of the church. In the Episcopal liturgy, do the two of you go to an Episcopal church now? Is that correct? Yeah. In the Episcopal liturgy, this means to worship was given to me. Scripture reading, spoken prayers, in the Holy Eucharist. I love the body worship of bowing one's head when Jesus' name was spoken, kneeling in prayer, standing in song. making the sign of the cross at various times during the service. The liturgy gave me a way to worship God again and was an important step in my healing. So I thought this was really an interesting strategy, or it probably wasn't a strategy, but a mechanism for healing your or contributing to your sense of the Lord. And I've heard this from other people that we know through ICSA that have had a sort of their path has taken that route. Say something about this to us, Wendy, because if you're raised in a Bible-based, fundamentalist, evangelical, whatever descriptor we want to use, tradition, moving over to a liturgical system of worship is quite a step. Go ahead.
It was quite a step because I grew up in a Baptist. I grew up in the Baptist church, and we didn't see the Catholics as being really Christians, because they were just every week they'd go to church and they would just perform a ritual. But they weren't really Christians. So when Doug said, Wendy, we may have to go to a different kind of church. We may need to go to a liturgical church. I had not been to a liturgical church. I didn't know what to do. So we ended up going to a church, and we went to the 8 o'clock service. And I'm going to tell Doug's story. We went to the 8 o'clock service because Doug was working in retail at the time, and he worked on Sundays. So we went to the 8 o'clock service, and there weren't a handful of people there. So we walk in, we sit toward the back, and they start the service, and we just watched the other people. When they knelt, we knelt. When they bowed their head, we bowed. We just did whatever they were doing. Well, at the time when it came to take the Eucharist, we sat there. All the other people went up to the front to the altar and knelt. And the priest came out from behind the altar and he said, "Do you people want to have communion with us?" And Doug said, "We're not Episcopalians. We don't, we don't think we should do that." And the priest said, "We welcome all baptized believers. Come just as you are." And so we did. We went up to the front of the church and to the altar and knelt, and we took communion. And it was just one of those very moving experience.
It felt right. It felt right.
And for Doug, because he was also sure that that God didn't want to have anything to do with us, because that was another thing that we were taught. If we left the group, then we were leaving God, and God, we were almost disciple, and God didn't want anything to do with us. So it felt to Doug when the priest said, "You want to have communion?" It felt like it was God reaching out and saying, "Come back. You're welcome. Come back. Come back." So it was just really cool. I kind of didn't tell the story probably as Doug would, but Doug, forgive me. I told the essence, right, Doug? So
and the aspect of it feeling safe, was that a central part of it? It felt safe in a different kind of a way.
It feels safe because when I couldn't pray and when I couldn't read my Bible, the words were given to me in the form of the liturgy. God's word was given to me, even though I didn't know how to pray. The liturgy, part of the liturgy has prayer. And so I was able to reconnect with God through the liturgy. And, there's still times when I get goosebumps during the liturgy. And I know, this is my story. This is how I did it. I'm not saying everybody needs to go to a liturgical church, but I'm just saying that was helpful for us. And I tell you, another thing is that the day that I decided I'm out of here, I'm out of this cult. I didn't know it was a cult. I didn't say it was a cult. But the day that I said I'm out, I went to the bookstore, a Christian bookstore, and I bought a Bible, another translation than the one that our group used. I didn't know to do that. I mean, I don't know why I did it, but now we hear that from a lot of cult experts. Use a different translation of the Bible than your cult used. find a different kind of church than your group was. So, you want to get away from the things that remind you of your group, and start building a new relationship with God.
Well, it's very uplifting and encouraging to read your story and your not pointers, but the points that you highlighted in your chapter, Wendy. We're going to turn it over here to any other questions that people have. I could go on talking about this forever. You did a really good job, and as I said, I think this is one of the best chapters in our book. But yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say this because I know that you can relate. At some point when you were a pastor at a church, a lot of people came in that had been in a church that was spiritually abusive, and they came into your church. And so you had a ministry with people that were hurting, spiritually hurting. So a couple of years ago, I wrote this proposal called the Wounded Sheep Project. And it is a call to churches to reach out to people who have been, who have experienced spiritual abuse and who are not connected to God, who are estranged from God and his church, and to help them in their recovery, help them in that healing process. Because, a lot of churches, we have a food pantry, we have a clothes closet, and, we have all these different ministries, but I don't know of any churches, except for the one that you had, that actually reach out to people who have been hurt by the church. So anyway, I wrote that proposal, and the church that we are at now is sponsoring it. And so we are in the beginning of implementing the project, because we want to reach out to those people that are unchurched, non-churched, used to be churched, and help them in their healing.
Well, congratulations on that. I think many churches should be doing this.
Okay.
At least become aware whether your church has whether a person's church has the resources, the assets to actually organize an embracing of people. At least be aware. And I've said this to Michael and to Nava. I think I said it to her too. I'm finding our subject in this book a hard sell. I think initially we thought people will be, they'll be knocking themselves over to get to the door to buy copies of this book. But it even in the circles that I'm in now, which is a pretty reasonable spiritual environment, people don't want to talk about it. And churches need to be doing what you're trying to do in your church, or what that church is attempting to do. Yeah, wounded sheep.
It is very threatening. And I've talked to clergy multiple times, various clergy. It is a very threatening topic for them. But yet, let's look at the Catholic Church and all the sexual abuse, the sexual abuse scandal. Let's look at the Southern Baptist Church and all the problems there. I mean, all over, there are problems in the kingdom of God.
There are, and it doesn't serve anybody by not addressing them, by ignoring them, first of all. Okay. Nava, back to you.
A couple of questions already, and our first question is, how are you reaching out to people who have been hurt by a church?
Could you say that again, please?
How are you reaching out to people who have been hurt by a church? I think this is referring to the wounded sheep.
Right. We are in the process of starting the Wounded Sheep Project. And what we're doing is bringing awareness of it, writing articles for local media, written media. We're planning to have something called a listening session, where we invite the community to come and talk to us about church hurts. So we'll say something like disappointed in God, disappointed in the church, disillusioned, confused. Come talk to us. We want to hear you. So we're going to have a listening where they can talk to us and tell us what the church should be doing to help them. So we're doing that, and then we're going to have a support group specifically for people who want to recover and heal their image of God. Our regular support group, that's not the focus, but a support group that the church sponsors will be. And we'll also have workshops on healing your image of God, those kind of things. So we've got a lot planned. We're just implementing it right now.
Great.
But let me just say this: when Doug and I started the support group, the 15 years ago, we had no idea what we were doing, and we said to each other, "What are we doing?" Because we didn't know. But we put a little ad in the Dallas paper about the support group, and now we don't do any marketing at all, and we have tons of people that have come and go through the support group. It's just been amazing. And now we're doing it on Zoom, so we have people all over the country that attend. Did that answer the question?
I think so. The next question that we have is, do you have any resources for healing from codependency post-religious cult?
Do I have any resources for codependency from?
Do you have any resources for healing from codependency post-religious cult?
I would have to think about that, but I can look through my library and maybe send out a resource list if people are interested in that.
Great.
So is the idea there, Nava, someone is connected to somebody else and they have come out, but it's harder to come out when you're connected to somebody else. Is that the idea?
I'm not sure. That's the question. But if the person who asked this question wants to follow up, then I'll ask them.
Okay.
Okay. Is your Wounded Sheep project published, and could it be used by other churches?
Oh, good question. It is. I have on our website, www.spiritualabuseministry.com. I have a section on the Wounded Sheep project, so people can go there and get more information. We are, again, we're just in the initial stage, but I'm hoping that we can develop a prototype that other churches can use. I would love for all churches to have some kind of ministry to the wounded sheep. My heart hurts for them. People that once had a relationship with God, and because of spiritual abuse, they're disconnected and estranged. We need to figure out how to bring them back, how to help them heal. So yeah, I hope all churches will do it eventually.
What was your ministry's website again? Tell us the website again.
It's www.spiritualabuseministry, all one word, .com.
Okay.
Or the easy one is www.dallascult.com. That's easier. But on the menu page, you can go and see the different articles, because we talk about spiritual abuse and that sort of thing. Do you want to read some of the comments that people are making?
Yeah. There's one question I'll ask you first, just to make sure the questions get knocked out, and then I'll go through the comments. So we have two questions now. I've been out for 30 years, and I'm still angry at friends from the time who immediately joined other Christian churches and went on like nothing had been wrong. Is anger at other old cult members common?
I would say yes, it is very common. People come to terms with things at their own individualized way. A lot of people don't really want to believe that there's something wrong with their church. So what they're going to want to criticize the person who left and say, well, they just didn't really understand. They didn't know. That's not us. They'll make excuses for things. But yeah, that's real common.
This person is talking about the Wounded Sheep Project and said, "That's a wonderful idea. Thank you. I've been saying that since I left the cult I was in. I believe faith groups and churches must have a home for those of us who have been abused and deeply wounded in order for us to heal and find a new spiritual home. I've been trying to reconnect with the Catholic Church after being part of a right-wing, extreme, abusive Catholic cult. And I feel that this is the next step and very needed by the Catholic Church as a whole, and specifically the Catholic Church I'm exploring, that I find loving and welcoming on a general level, but I still feel there isn't room for my story or anyone else who has been deeply hurt."
Yeah, that is so sad. And I know a lot of churches don't get it. A lot of, when we talk with church members and they say, spiritual abuse, what's that? And they don't understand that that there are pastors, there are priests, there are that use their power and authority to hurt people that, who are Christians. And so they don't understand. We feel like, though, that telling your story, being able to process it in a safe environment is crucial. And so the more that you're able to articulate it in a safe place where you're validated, it is just, it does wonders for you.
And we have
seeing those messages I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. I can't.
No, it's okay. We have another comment that's very similar who says, "I'm a Catholic who has undergone a similar experience. It took me 30 years to find a Catholic church where I felt truly safe. In the meantime, I didn't know where to address these issues. I think each diocese needs to implement this program." Much of the book and discussion involved legalistic and harsh churches. My group was charismatic, as was my prior experience with God. It's very difficult to even begin to separate what was genuine experience of God from delusion. In my group, I believe the leaders were honestly misled.
Yeah. I don't know really what the question is, but absolutely there, it's hard to find a place to feel safe and to be able to share your story. Most people think that, you did something wrong, that you were the one that was wrong, not the church. The church could never be wrong. But there are churches that abuse. There are churches that hurt. And I think promoting awareness of that, I think that helps people that are in that situation, to realize that their feelings and their thoughts are valid. They're real. They were hurt. And I don't know. Neil, do you have anything to add?
Well, the phrase, I'm not familiar with the phrase direct spiritual experience, but what the questioner means by that. But that is, if I understand what that means, that's sort of a fundamental philosophical aspect of, if I go to this group, will God show up too? Will I have a direct spiritual experience? Will he communicate with me directly? I'm not sure if that's what, in Pentecostal circles, of course, that's rudimentary. God shows up, God speaks to us. He speaks freshly to us all the time. And I'm not sure if that's what the questioner means by that, but if that's something related, it's an interesting and a difficult question to parse, I think, depending on what church you're in. I mean, an Episcopal church where some of us go, there wouldn't be any, it's through the liturgy, it's through the worship, there's not any sense of direct at the moment communication. But other churches, that's actually one of the sacraments, almost, you'd say. You got a follow-up comment, Nava, that was posted.
We believe God spoke very directly to us.
Yeah, so that is what we're talking about. And, that's to me, as I ponder this not just in the context of ICSA and people being wounded spiritually, but the bigger question, is God around? Is he speaking to us? Is he communicating to us directly? That's a difficult question, very controversial. We all wish that was just something that could just be sort of brokered by a church service, by a pastor, by a prophet, somebody. We just wish that would make. We didn't have to walk by faith then. We could walk by sight. Or walk by hearing anyway. But it's a difficult question, and I don't think we're going to solve it in the next 100 years even to get universal agreement unless God just shows up or something. We're seeking, we're hungering. You gave a good verse. I was looking for it in the chapter, Wendy. You quoted, in fact, it was amusing to me that it was an Old Testament quotation, which I thought was great. I'm looking for it. It was from the book of Numbers, which is even more amusing to me because the book of Numbers just doesn't get quoted very often at all. And I'll find it here in a minute because I did underline it, I think. But it was an encouraging affirmation, kind of a promise. Yeah, Numbers 6. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. The idea that this was the wish, the blessing wished for at that moment in Israel's history. The Lord bless thee and keep thee, make his face shine upon thee, which I guess is probably used. You probably hear that in the liturgy sometimes, don't you? At the end of the service or something, And I know Catholic churches will use that too, but that's a very positive wish for the leadership to invoke upon the people. Just that's not direct communication from God, but anyway, I could go on forever about this subject, but yeah, okay.
Well, when we get through with this, I'm going to say, why didn't I say that? And why didn't I say that? I'm going to think of all these things I should have said. But I'm going to just say one or two of them that just occurred to me. Reading books is very, very helpful. Journaling, writing down about your experience is very, very helpful. And trying to find some safe people that understand and can help you with your confusion and your, all the different issues. That's really important too.
And if I can just sort of summarize my own perspective on this a little bit to close off here, we're all broken people, and nobody's perfect, nobody's fully well-adjusted that I've met yet, and I know a lot of people. Everybody's got some dimension of brokenness about them, or fear, or skepticism, but my belief, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Wendy and Doug as well, is that God is interested in us, has a loving approach to us, feeling about us, if I can use that word, and anything that distorts that, which is what the subject of today's webinar really is the image of God that people have, ought to be prosecuted, because that's not helpful, because that's not who God is. And we're all hungry, we're all broken, we all have different weaknesses, disabilities, incapacities. Is that a word? It should be anyway. That we're trying to fill up and repair. And my persuasion is, as I'm sure Wendy and Doug's as well, is that God is interested in that. He's interested in us seeing him as he really is, and anything that messes that up, ought to be identified. And so, as Wendy said, thinking this through yourself with a journal, and talking about it with people. Sometimes people are afraid to talk about this. That was never the case for me in Dartmouth. People didn't seem afraid of me at all. But they need to have the freedom to talk through how they feel that, who is God? What's he like? And if something's been wired in me that's wrong, that's hurtful, then I need to get that rewired, So,
Yeah.
All right.
But and if I may just say one more thing, I know I have said that about 10 times, but this is it. This is really the last thing I want to say. Henry Nouwen, I don't know if y'all are familiar with him. He's written a lot of books, but he said that realizing that you are his beloved, once people realize, once they really sit with that thought of I am his beloved, and just really sit and bask in that, that is just so healing. Me, Wendy Duncan, who, nobody, but I'm his beloved. And that's huge. I'm his beloved. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Well, that's critical. and ought to be a central part of our message. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Wendy and Neil, for a great webinar. I'm going to end the recording and then I'm going to end the webinar, but thank everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to Wendy and Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating. If you're interested in continuing to support ICSA, please join or donate at icsahome.com/membership.